Okay, so this is our last new information for government. This is the unit on political culture and voting. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at, first of all, what makes citizens aware of politics. It's called political socialization. Then we're going to look at the various amendments that guarantee rights to vote in the United States. And then we're going to take a look at why citizens choose to vote or not vote, especially choose to vote a certain way. Okay, so first let's take a look at political culture. In other words, what influences our political decisions? Okay, first of all, what is political? This is political socialization. These are our beliefs and values and norms that citizens hold towards their government. Okay, we'll go over those, the specific ones, in a couple of slides here. It varies from country to country and from region to region. So you can look at different parts of the United States, the Northeast, the South, the West, the Midwest, and you can look at each of those and say they kind of have their own political beliefs. This is what we call political science, actually looking at why people vote a certain way. It changes over time. There are sections of the country, for instance, the South used to be very solidly Democratic. The Democrats could always count on the southern states after the Civil War to support their presidential candidates and their senators and their representative candidates and so forth. That's changed. The South has become very Republican, and that changed after the Civil Rights Movement. South moved mainly from Democrat to Republican. Now it seems to be, as more people are moving into the South, it seems to be becoming a more of a diverse area of politics. And it's used to predict political behavior. So a politician is elected from a conservative district. How is he or she expected to vote? Or if a politician is elected from a liberal district, same thing. How are they expected to vote? Okay, now, these are some things to know. Political socialization. What makes us, what influences us, what institutions in our society influence us to have certain political views? Demography, the study of population trends. The United States in the last 25 years has become a more immigrant-based culture. We have more immigrants coming into the United States, kind of like it was in the early 20th century. Political predispositions. Persons in certain demographic categories tend to vote alike and tend to share certain political beliefs that can predict their behavior. For instance, white middle-class Americans kind of are split, 50-50 Democrat and Republican. That one's hard to predict. White upper-class Americans, people that earn, $250,000 and higher per year, tend to vote Republican. Black Americans tend to vote Democrat. Latinos tend to vote Democrat. Those are what we're talking about. Now, those aren't 100%. There are Black Americans that are Republicans. There are wealthy whites that vote Democrat. Those are not 100%, but these are used to predict political behavior. Okay, reinforcing cleavages. When social and economic differences reinforce each other, it can make political conflict more intense and society more polarized. Okay, we are living in a polarized political age right now. The House and the Senate, control of the House and Senate, ping-pongs back and forth between Republican control and Democratic control. That shows more of our political cleavages in the United States than anything. Rural versus urban voters, people that live in farmland, tend to be more conservative. They don't like the government telling them what to do. They like to farm their land and be left alone. Now, that isn't 100% true. And then urban voters tend to be Democrat because seems to be, because of the concentration of population in urban areas, there tends to be more social problems. So they look towards government to solve those problems. Those areas tend to be more Democratic. Religious versus non-religious voters. If somebody attends church services every week, more than likely they're a conservative Republican. If they don't attend church every week, or don't attend church at all, they tend to vote Democratic. The key word there is tend. Okay? Then there's cross-cutting cleavages. Instead of reinforcing each other, differences pull people in different directions. White and African American religious voters. Okay, that's a good example. There's similarities and there's differences. There are African American voters because they go to church every week and the church has socialized them, have very conservative social values. But a lot of African Americans that go to church on a weekly basis vote Democrat. So even though the church and the values of the church kind of push them politically towards Republican values, they vote Democrat. Okay, again, that's not 100%. Okay, these differences can be regional. They can be among, city, towns, and neighborhoods. I read a book last summer that said that Americans are tending to move to areas where folks have their neighbors have the same political viewpoints as them. Race, ethnicity, gender, including someone's sexual orientation, their family, their education, their wealth, their social class, what job they have, how old they are, okay? These can all create various political viewpoints. Okay, the older people get, for instance, age, the more conservative they get, the more Republican they get. Okay, now what influences our political culture, our individual political viewpoints? Okay, again, these are not absolutes, they're just trends. Okay, our first sociological political influence, in fact, our first sociological influence on us is our family. We acquire a majority of our partisanship from our parents. If our parents tend to be political and they, at the dinner table talk about Republican politics, well, then the family, the kids, are probably going to be Republican. And if they talk about democratic values, then the kids are probably going to be Democrat. Religious differences make for political differences, especially concerning social issues. Abortion is a good issue. Same-sex marriage is a good issue. The more people go to church on a weekly basis, the more religious they are, the more they're going to be against abortion and same-sex marriages. Okay? That's not 100% absolute. Gender. Men tend to be more Republican. Women tend to vote more Democratic. Schooling. If you're college educated, that usually results in more liberal attitudes. Okay? Social class. If you're, whatever you're associated with your occupation, if you're a skilled worker, you work with your hands, you're what they call blue collar, you tend to be more conservative, more Republican. If you're unskilled, if you're white collar, you tend to be more liberal. Race, Asian Americans and Hispanics tend to be more liberal. Whites and Asian Americans tend to be more conservative. Your region or your country, where you're from. Different states tend to be either more Democratic or Republican, depending on their location. The South tends to be more conservative than the Northeast and the West. Those are more liberal areas. So again, just because somebody lives in Georgia in the South doesn't mean that they're Republican or they vote Republican all the time. Georgia voted for Biden in the 2020 election, and they sent 2 Democratic senators to the Senate, obviously, in 2020 for the first time in really since I think since probably the 1950s or early 1960s. Okay, now, even though there's all of these political differences regionally, what brings us together? What are our shared political values? Okay, here's what we believe in. Natural rights. You're born with the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You have liberty, freedoms. Equality is something that we believe in, okay? Just because we believe in it doesn't mean that it happens. Just because you wish for something doesn't mean that it's going to happen. But I think you can say we've become, if you look at the long arc of American history, we've become more equal as our society. We're not perfect, but we've become more equal. Individualism, okay? We believe in the rights of the individual, whether that's politically. You vote for yourself. Once you turn 18 and you're registered, you have the right to vote. You vote for yourself. Even economically, we have a a system where individuals make economic choices, and that determines how our economy is going to go. Majority rule, whoever gets the most votes gets to be the party in power. We believe in popular sovereignty. The basis of the government is based on the will of the people. We give the government permission to rule over us. The first three words of the Constitution, we the people. We believe in justice and the rule of law. Okay, you have your day in court. If you're accused of a crime, you have your day in court. We believe in patriotism. Is politically divided as we are, I think that Democrats and Republicans all believe in and love the United States. Just because somebody says we can be better doesn't mean they don't love the country. But, if they want us to be better, I think that means they do love the country. Okay? All right, now, let's talk about voting rights. Where do these voting rights come from? First of all, voting rights have been expanded greatly in the United States since the Civil War. Even before the Civil War, you had to be a property owner. You had to be white and male, and you had to be a property owner to vote at the beginning of the Republic. Since that time, before the Civil War, many states expanded the right to vote to non-white male property owners. Okay? Since the Civil War, though, various amendments have been added to the Constitution. And it's mainly because people use nonviolent protest to bring about these changes. Now, the first one, the 15th Amendment, which gave black males the right to vote. The 15th Amendment says the right to vote cannot be denied on the basis of race. Now, of course, that was not a nonviolent protest. That was a result of the Civil War. The Civil War was extremely violent, the most violent time period in the history of the United States. But since that time, the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators. Senators used to be appointed by state legislators. And a lot of times in a lot of states around the United States, whoever paid the most money to the governor got to be the senator. That's not very democratic. So the 17th Amendment says the people shall vote for senators in each of their states. That was passed in 1912. Okay? And that was a result of Americans saying, enough with this political corruption. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. And of course, the long history of women trying to gain the right to vote finally happened in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. The 24th Amendment, because of the civil rights movement, abolished the poll tax. The poll tax is money used to have to pay to vote, and it was used in a way that discriminated against African Americans. White Americans were exempt from the poll tax because of grandfather clauses. If your grandfather could vote, or your nearest relative before the generation before you could vote, you didn't have to pay the tax. Black Americans did, and they charged them enough money where blacks said, I don't have that kind of money. I'm not going to pay to vote. So they were taxed out of voting. That was abolished by the 24th Amendment. And then the 26th Amendment, as a result of protests during the Vietnam War, because during the Vietnam War, when there was a draft, 18-year-olds and above could be drafted into the military. But 18, 19, and 20-year-olds didn't have the right to vote, not until 1971, when the 26th Amendment, a lot of college students and young folks who were drafted said, it's not fair. These politicians are passing these draft laws, but we don't have the right to vote to put them into office. So the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18, and that was nationally. Okay, now, how do citizens vote? Once they get into the voting booth, besides, political sociology, what make them vote a certain way? Okay? What influences them, I should say, to vote a certain way? There's rational choice. I think this is what most people do today. They vote based on their individual interests. If somebody just lost their job and they're unemployed, they may vote for economic issues. If somebody owns a business and they feel like, oh my gosh, there's too many taxes on my business, it's eating into my profits, they're going to vote for the candidate that was going to lower their taxes. Okay? I don't think that one is difficult to understand. That's called rational choice. Okay, retrospective and prospective voting, they go together. This is more along the lines of what we learned earlier in the year is candidate-centered politics, where we look, instead of party, we look at the person running and the personality, okay? If they're an incumbent running for office, that's somebody who is currently sitting in the office, they've already been voted in, and they're running for re-election. We judge them based on their recent political performance. Most of the time, incumbents are re-elected to office. It's very rare that an incumbent is not re-elected. And it's very rare that a sitting president, is not re-elected. So what happened in 2020 hadn't happened in over 25 years in the United States. So that happens like once in a generation. Okay? Donald Trump was judged based on how his job performance was, and a majority of Americans said, we don't want him in office anymore. And then there's prospective voting, judging a challenger based on how he or she will perform once they're in. That's why Biden was one of the reasons why Biden was elected in 2020. We don't know how he's going to be as president, but we judge him based on how he's going to do. So it's not just enough to say, this politician stinks, we want them out of office. There's got to be somebody running who has a plan that people say, voters say, I agree with this plan, and I think because of this plan, this person can do a good job. And then there's party line voting. This is the way it used to be 120 years ago, okay? And this is lessened over time, especially since World War II. People, people still party line vote. They say, I'm going to vote for nothing but Republicans, or I'm going to vote for nobody, only Democrats. And they do it from national offices, state offices, down to local offices, okay? About 30% of the public vote that way still. Okay, now, what impacts voter turnout? By the way, voter turnout has increased especially among young people, since I've been teaching government for almost 25 years. Okay, but what impacts voter turnout? National versus state or local elections. If it's a national election, even numbered year. Okay, 2020 we had a presidential election. Presidential elections bring voters out of the woodwork. Okay, those have the highest voter turnout rates. In 2022, we're going to have a congressional election. We're going to elect everybody in the House of Representatives will be up for re-election, and then a third of the Senate will be up for re-election. Voter turnout will be high that year. Not as high as it was in 2020, but it'll be higher than it is in 2021. We hold elections every year. 2021 are going to be state and local elections. Those tend to have lower voter turnout. Okay? Voter turnout is higher in presidential, especially presidential and congressional elections. But voter laws, which are controlled by the states, also determine voter turnout. If a state has not less restrictive, I want to say, early voting. Okay? Early voting, obviously, is voting before Election Day. You vote in a provisional ballot, an absentee ballot. It used to be you actually had to be absent on Election Day to prove that you were absent on Election Day to get an absentee ballot. In other words, let's say you were a college student and you live in Cincinnati, but you go to Ohio State. Okay? Well, you're going to be in classes in Columbus. You'll get a mail-in ballot or a absentee ballot. What states have done, they've changed those rules really since 2008. And what states have found out is if they allow people to vote, more people to vote early, voter turnout increases. If they increase the amount of mail-in votings, which they did in the 2020 election because of COVID, states said, we don't want, lines and lines of people like you see in the image here waiting to vote. That's going to spread COVID. So let's allow people to mail in their ballots. And believe it or not, I don't think this is going to be hard to believe, but the more states that did that, the more voter turnout there was. So you're going to hear this and you're going to say, duh, the easier we make it to vote, the more people turn out to vote. Okay? So that impacts whether or not people can vote. All right, there you go. There is your information on voting. If you have any questions on it, don't forget to fill out the chart and put your questions in there, but you can also send me an email.